Hi. So, ever since my husband gave his testimony at Easter, we've had a lot of questions about his grandmother and wanting to know more of the story. So, we thought we would tell you more of his grandmother's story. So, why don't you start with just the basics of your grandmother, what her name
Yeah.
is, and all of
So, Grandma Tsuku Omachi, she was the youngest of 10 children, actually, I found out. 8 sisters and 1 brother. And the oldest sister actually was the one who married my grandfather, Masao Omachi, and came to the States to start his business. And during that time when they were in the States, they had 4 children. And but then again, the eldest sister contracted pneumonia and died in the United States, leaving 4 children, ages 13 to 4. So then at that point, my grandmother was the only sister who hadn't married. And so my grandfather decided, I need another, I need a wife to take care of the kids and help me start my business. So he contacted the Omachi family and flew back to Japan, or boated back to Japan, and took the 2 girls, who were the oldest and the youngest, so 13 and 4 years old, with the idea that they would stay in Japan while he got the business going and again started fresh with a new marriage. So left the boys behind with the manager of the store that he was starting, and went to Japan and asked my grandmother if she would consider marrying him and taking care of the children.
So, a little bit of background on her. She grew up in what was the area in Japan that she grew up in?
Shimabara, which is in the southern island of Kyushu.
And so she grew up in a very Buddhist area, but had through missionaries in her area that held Sunday school on Sundays. And she and her sisters, she said she remembered going with them, and she became a Christian through missionaries in Japan, which was really unusual in that era and very rare to see converts in Japan at that time. So when his grandfather Masao returned to Japan and asked to marry her, he was how much older than her?
25 years
25
older.
years older.
Yeah, not 35.
Yeah, 25 years older, and she had a decision to make, and her faith informed that decision. And so maybe say a little bit of what you know about that decision.
Yeah, I mean, I think the bottom line for my grandmother was it wasn't a forced arrangement in the traditional sense, but she really sought the Lord and through prayer and really wanted to do the right thing. And it became clear to her that God was having her take care of these kids. Like that was kind of her mission in life. And again, with no English background whatsoever, going to a foreign land, she just really felt like her faith was saying, through God, I can do this through Christ. So that really influenced her decision and to take on such a huge task.
So they left the 2 daughters in Japan, returned back to the United States, where she met her nephews, who are also now her
right, sons.
yeah, who are
sons
suddenly now her not sons-in-laws, her stepsons.
Oh yeah.
So now her new stepsons, and they continued working on the business that Masao had started just outside of Sacramento of selling like a little general store to the farmers in the area. But this was right in the 1930s.
So that was like 1930, and then the Depression hit. So my grandmother, in this biography, she had said, my comfortable, easy life in America was ended after just 1 year, which I think is amazing that she would consider starting fresh in a new country with 2 kids easy. But then things became difficult and the business was suffering. For many years, they were cared for by the farmers who used that mercantile store. But she also then mentioned that it was her church family who also really surrounded them and took care of them, which I think is, again, just a really cool thing to see a community of believers just take on a family like that. And Masao was, as far as we know, was not a believer at all. He was really more of a Buddhist. And but her faith and her bringing her boys with her to church, that community took care of her really well until we get to World War II.
Well, back up in 1932, in the middle of all this, what happened?
Is this a quiz?
Yes.
I don't know.
Who was born in
Oh, yeah,
1932?
right. Oh, yeah. So, small, insignificant thing. As if, so they had decided to have one child in the United States, and that one child was my mother, Tomoko, born in 1932. So again, a year into the Depression, they brought a child into the world, but that daughter was very tight with my grandmother. So my mom was raised also then going to church at an early age, and really had made a decision at that point. But I think futuristically, she really kind of let go of that faith, or didn't really pursue God in any way during her adult life.
So they weren't able to bring the daughters back to the United States because of the Great Depression and the financial struggles they were having. Things were starting to get better. And then in the 1940s, another major event happened, and that was World War II. So maybe just talk a little bit about people who don't maybe know that part of our history as well. What happened after Pearl Harbor, the bombing of Pearl Harbor in December of 1940?
Japan became very aggressive in their goals in the war, and part of that was the Pacific. And even though they were such a small nation, it was kind of unthinkable that they would actually attack the United States, which they did in the end of 1941. At that point, there was a lot of paranoia about the Japanese and their intentions in bringing the United States into the war. So panic really hit. And President Roosevelt in 1942 basically declared the Executive Order 9066, the infamous order, that was posted, that was then going to pull all of the Japanese people on the West Coast into some type of facility. The government really communicated it as more of a safety thing for the Japanese people, but it was clear that it was not about safety for them. It was about the paranoia of the Japanese attack. So my whole family, so my dad and my mom, at the time they were in their families, they were all sent to internment camps. Again, Masao's business was completely destroyed at that point, and he would never revisit that business again. And they were then moved to Tule Lake, and then on to Hart Mountain in Wyoming.
I think an important piece, so suddenly the government decides to intern an entire race of people in the United States, and they were not prepared to do that. So initially, his family was held in the Sacramento Fairgrounds in a horse stall while they were building these camps, and eventually ended up in Hart Mountain, Wyoming in winter. People from California with no jackets. His mom was 10 years old at that point and remembers only having sandals and not even like full shoes in the winter. So internment camp was really hard, and maybe tell a little bit about what happened to Masao and Suku and their family in the internment camp and some of the choices they had to make.
So, I mean, the ultimate thing that happened was Masao's health waned in that time. So my grandmother really had to step up her involvement, and now she has 3 kids, the 2 boys and my mom. At that point, the boys were of the age that they could potentially leave, and that's if they signed the loyalty oath, which was a very controversial oath, of course, and many Japanese chose not to. But my family wanted to show their loyalty to the U.S., so they actually all signed that loyalty oath, yes, meaning these 2 significant questions that essentially said, yes, we are loyal, and we cut off any loyalty to Japan. And
now, one important thing I think is interesting, they had the choice before they went into internment camps to return to Japan. And so his family had to decide, do we return and get to see those two girls, or do we enter internment camp? And Suko and Masao, according to Tomoko, wanted to return to Japan, and the two boys and Tomoko did not, because all they knew was the United States as home. So they all decided to stay and enter internment camps. And so Masao ended up having a stroke in the camp, and conditions weren't great, and so it was really hard on their health. How many years were they interned?
Well, so again, once they signed that loyalty oath, it was interesting because Aki, so the two boys, Aki and Hank, ended up leaving camp early, which again is something that historically not a lot of people know, that because they were way far away from the Pacific and they signed the loyalty oath, they were allowed to leave camp early, and Hank, the oldest, signed up actually to join the military and wanted to fight for the U.S. So he joined the Army at that point. He was, I think, 19 or 20. And then Aki, who was just a little bit younger, was allowed to go and start schooling. So they actually were released before camp was closed. Leaving, again, my grandmother and just Tomoko, just the two of them, to care for Masao. And they stayed in camps till the end, when they were then forced to leave by a certain point.
They were given a bus ticket and how much
Yeah.
money? $100?
Yeah, I don't even know.
Something like that.
It's really small.
And so they went to live with
Aki.
Aki was in college in Minnesota. And so they went to live, imagine being a college student, and now your family all moves in with you. And so they all lived with Aki, and
Yep. And my mom was, so several years later then, at that point my mom was getting into finishing her high school career. That's when Masao died. So again, he never really recovered from camp, and certainly didn't return back to work of any kind, and at that point he was quite a bit older. So that left my grandmother basically in care of Tomoko, who was now entering the college years. The two older boys at that point had their own lives, were starting to build. So really at that point kind of was a finish point for Grandma. She felt like that was her commitment, was to see those boys get through college, not knowing that she would have a daughter. So at that point then, amazing enough, they were kind of floating, the two of them, now that Masao had died, still trying to figure out what their next step was going to be. Well,
and living with Aki.
And living with Aki while he was going to school. But
I think an interesting side note is Hank, who joined the military, was then stationed in Japan as part of the rebuilding effort after the war was won. And so he actually got to see his sisters again. And so they were reunited in Japan during that time. So, well, fast forward. Your mom has married your dad. They move out to California. And Aki got married and said, okay, your turn to take care of Grandma. And so Grandma came to live and was your primary caregiver. With your mom was a working mom, and she was your primary caregiver. What are your memories of her growing up?
Yeah, so again, she didn't speak a lot of English, just really broken, pretty difficult to communicate. And my parents, I was literally born in 1963, and she joined them, I think, even before that. So when I came into the world, she was a part of that family structure and would remain that way. I always grew up with my grandmother in our home. So, you know, the faith part I was pretty clueless at that time. I did go to church with her. My brother and I were forced to go to church with my grandmother and my mom. And she really...
to a Japanese-speaking church.
To a Japanese service, yeah. Methodist service. And it was just important to get my grandma there. My mom actually would drop her off, and then the three of us would go and shop, typically. But my brother and I, again, early on, didn't really enjoy it. It's kind of that, I don't want to get into a big can of worms, but it was almost like a reverse discrimination thing, where my brother and I grew up in an all-white area in Pacific Palisades, my dad purposely moved us away from his family and away from the Japanese community. I think that that goal of assimilation for him, and he was a college grad and actually went to graduate school at Harvard for architecture. So I think in his mind he was trying to raise us to be much more assimilated into culture. So so my grandma and I had a just a typical relationship, but I didn't get her faith at all. But I would hear her at night behind closed doors, and she would, now I know she was praying fervently for, I remember sometimes I'd look up and it'd be like 2 hours, like solid, just praying for our family, praying for her friends, praying for the salvation of her entire family. And what was amazing to me is, again, later, as I told you in the testimony, it wasn't, the light bulb went on. It really literally did. And it just all came together. What she was accomplishing in an eternal sense in that room by herself. And so then her and my relationship really significantly changed at that point. I was 17, getting ready to go to college, but she and I shared some really sweet moments at that point, since we couldn't really speak too well, but we could use the word. The word, so she had her Japanese Bible and I had the English Bible. And together we actually would share verses back and forth together, which was such a sweet part of our relationship. And again, a great foundation as I then moved out of the house. Right after I became a believer, I went to UCSB. And again, our relationship stayed really, really tight because of our shared faith at that point. So, yeah.
I want to take it full circle to the end of the story. We then, his mom, Tomoko, came to live with us and lived with us total of 7 years. And I think from my conversations with her, I think internment really did a number on her faith, because that was the sanctioned religion of the internment camps. You were allowed to have Christian churches. You were not allowed to have Buddhist temples or anything. So it does something when your captors are saying this is the right way. And when she left camp, she never went back to church. And so, I think she went occasionally for holidays or with his mom. But then she came to live with us, and she would occasionally come to church with us, and was very a self-described agnostic, and thought it was so great for us, and was always very complimentary of it. Was not like his dad, who was very antagonistic, but was very complimentary. And so a major blessing is the last month of her life. She knew she was dying, and we just had this conversation one day that led to heavenly things, and she came back to Christ and prayed with me, and was just, I remember her saying afterwards, I'm going to see my mama in heaven. And just to think of the generations and how it sort of skipped a generation and then came back. And I just think the faithfulness of Suku's prayers for all those years for her daughter and her grandson were answered. And so we hope this is an encouragement to you to keep praying for those family members. His mom was prayed for. I mean, she died at 86, and I think stopped going to church probably around age 14. That's a long time. So keep praying for those family members. And parents, have faith in the generational seeds that you are planting. Just hope that's an encouragement to you.